appreciate the organizing you're doing on this and the opportunity to speak with all of you. If you're on the East Coast, good afternoon, and if you're on the West Coast, where we are, good morning to everyone. What I thought I would do is in this session is really sort of do a 101 on a lot of the theories that we've researched over the last couple of decades to really make innovation a far more predictable and successful process. And what you'll notice is that I'm actually going to do very little on education specifically. I may talk about it in education contexts at some points, but as opposed to a lot of presentations I do, where I'll sort of jump back and forth between theory and then its application in education, I'm really just going to go very deep into how to structure innovation, uh, the innovation process, and how to think about some of the changes that you all are contemplating. So if at any point you have questions about how this applies, certainly we can go there. But there's a lot of material I have planned. So hopefully this will be useful to you as you structure the innovation processes you're going through. What I thought I would start with is a question that Clay Christensen, my co-author in Disrupting Class, and who our institute is named after, started when he entered academia in 1989 at the Harvard Business School as a doctoral student. The question he brought with him was, why do successful organizations fail? And it's a really interesting question if you step back from it for a moment, because why bad organizations with bad employees or bad processes, why they fail is fairly obvious. And yet, why successful ones with long track records and long histories of really owning the landscape, why they would collapse or fail is a lot less obvious. And yet, if you look through the sweep of history, you see this happening consistently. Organizations that were once at the top a generation or two later are invariably in the middle of the pack and the bottom, or even the bottom of the heap. You can look at businesses, that the companies that were once at the top of Fortune 50 list, a generation or two later are invariably in the middle of the pack or the bottom of the heap. You can look at the rise and fall of great nations. This is just a very repeatable pattern. And as Professor Christensen studied the problem, what he concluded was that it was actually the very principles of good management that, while helpful to organizations on the way up, actually ultimately spelled their demise as they reached that peak. And so someone from the Harvard Business School who had been teaching these theories of good management was very interested in understanding this counterintuitive process of why something that was so helpful on the way up actually sowed the seeds of so many organizations' demise. And that's what led to this theory of disruptive innovation. Now, disruptive innovation is a bit of a buzzword, but it means something very specific when it's used properly, and it has very predictive powers. And so to sort of illustrate this, what I've done on this screen here is plot a series of concentric circles. And what I want you to do is imagine that the innermost circle represents those people with the most expertise or wealth in a field. And that as you go out to the outer circles, it represents people with comparatively less expertise or less wealth. And what we see in every sector is that you can describe within each of these circles the sector based on a simple graph that shows performance on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And what we see is that in every sector, there's two trajectories of interest. The first one is this relatively flat line. It's the pace that customers can absorb in terms of improvement or performance over time. And the reason it's relatively flat is because people's basic lives don't actually change that much from day to day. So the problems that you had to solve yesterday are something like the problems that you'll have to tackle today, and something like what you'll have to solve tomorrow. Now, of course, there's a range. There's some people at the low end who are satisfied with very little in the way of performance, and there's some people at the high end who I'm sure you all have the misfortune of working with from time to time, who are never satisfied no matter how much you give them. But basically, we have these trajectories in our lives, and these are fairly stable. Now, the second line, which is the really interesting one, is the pace of technological improvement. And what this line shows is that technology in the early years of any industry on the left-hand side of that graph, when it gets its start, it's not good enough for the majority of users in any given field. But what it says is that technology predictably improves much faster than people's lives change, such that over time it actually overshoots what people need from a given technology. And so sometimes the march up that blue line are small year-to-year incremental improvements, and other times they're giant breakthrough leaps forward. But as we've studied this, what we've realized is that these small routine improvements and these giant breakthrough leaps forward are actually the same type of innovation because they sustain that blue line to allow the leading organizations to make better services, deliver better services for their leading users in the ways that they're structured to deliver these services. And as a result, we call them sustaining innovations because they're all sustaining that blue line. And what we notice is that incumbents, the leading organizations at the beginning of that blue line, are almost invariably the leaders at the end of that blue line. It doesn't matter how routine or breakthrough something is, because people are so motivated to better serve their best users or customers, they figure out ways to make these sustaining innovations work and invariably defeat sort of upstart organizations that come in and try to play the same sort of a game. Now, this is all well and good for the majority of innovation that goes on, but every once in a while, we notice that there's a second kind of innovation come out, and we gave it a really unfortunate name, disruptive innovation. And I say disruptive innovation is an unfortunate name because disruptive implies so many other things in the English language. It sort of sounds like that breakthrough leap forward, or in the context of education, disruption sounds like an absolutely terrible thing. But what we mean by it is something very specific, where the disruptive innovation brings forth to market something that's actually not as good as the leading innovation in the inner circle, as judged by the historical measures of performance. But it enables these new value propositions, things around affordability, convenience, simplicity, accessibility, customization, things like that. And as a result, for all these people in these outer circles that could not afford or use for any number of reasons the leading innovation, they're just delighted with this new, simpler innovation that gives them access to something which was way better than their alternative, nothing at all. And it plants itself there, and in essence, it disrupts the trajectory of improvement that had been going on in that inner circle. And that's why we gave it its name. And so it starts itself there, and then true to form, it starts improving year by year by year. And over time, we see people migrate from the inner circle until the outer one. And the interesting thing is that entrants typically win at these disruptive innovations. And our sense is for why this is that when you're the leading organization in that inner circle, it doesn't make sense to offer something that is far simpler or more primitive or cheaper or doesn't solve maybe the most demanding problem in front of you. It just doesn't make any sense to devote resources to that. And so as a result, you buckle down and stay focused on that inner circle, and you actually willingly give ground to these entrant organizations in these outer circles that are pioneering the disruptions. And as they get better and better, by the time people in the inner circle really realize what's happening, the story is too late. And sort of people have rapidly adopted this upstart innovation, and that's how transformation occurs in sector after sector. And so you see this process play itself out in industry after industry. And I just thought I'd give a couple of examples to illustrate the point. And then we can sort of go one level deeper about why this happens. But if you look, for example, what I've done here in the Today column is put names of organizations whose stock we wish we had owned over the previous few decades, because they've been disruptive to those organizations in the yesterday column who in their own right were once disruptive. And what we see is that you can tell this story play itself out over and over again. And so, for example, Ford and General Motors used to be the dominant inner circle car companies in the world. And then you saw this upstart Toyota in the outer circle get their start. And what's interesting is they didn't start at the high end with the high-flying Lexuses for which we now know and admire Toyota. Instead, they started at the low end in the 1960s with this crummy car called a Corona. And if you put yourself in the position of the folks at GM and Ford looking out at these folks from Japan coming with this car called the Corona that rusted really quickly and wasn't all that good, you would have said, why would we build a crummy small car out there when we have the luxury of continuing to focus on a Ford Explorer or a Cadillac Escalade? But what they didn't count on was the motivation of Toyota to keep getting better. And so from the Corona, Toyota got better and introduced a Tercel, and then a Corolla, and then a Camry, and then the 4Runner and the Avalon, and then the Lexus, and then quite literally changed the world. And what's interesting is from the perspective of the users of the first Toyota Corona, this car didn't look crummy at all because it was way better than their alternative, nothing at all, because they couldn't afford the gas-guzzling cars that Detroit was creating. And so, again, GM and Ford just did the very logical thing, which was to focus on making bigger and better Ford Explorers and Cadillac Escalades, ignored Toyota coming from the outside for very logical reasons, but then got killed by it, and we know they eventually went bankrupt. And what's interesting is that Toyota is now being disrupted over the last several years. And they didn't feel it until recently because they had the privilege of stealing market share at the high end from Lexus or Mercedes-Benz. But Kia and Hyundai, the Koreans, have been coming up underneath them. And currently this is a commercial or advertisement that Hyundai was running a couple years ago, where they said, isn't it time someone did to Lexus what Lexus did to Mercedes? And if you think about it, 10 years ago, we would have made fun of the quality of the Korean cars, but now they own the subcompact and compact ends in the market, and they're winning all of the quality awards and increasingly moving into the luxury segment. And underneath them are the Chinese and Chery, perhaps, and you can tell this story over and over again. In department stores, there used to be 300 plus full service department stores across this country, and discount retail in the 1960s, and Walmart, Kmart, and Target entered. And really, if you were a department store manager there, you would look out at these guys and say, why would I give discount retail when we offer full service? It just doesn't make any sense. But they didn't count on the new value propositions these things enabled people to have. And sure enough, Walmart, Kmart, and Target have gotten better and better to the point where Target is now called Target. And department stores really have been wiped out as a result. And of course, online retail is coming up underneath them. If you look at education, state universities were sort of decentralized by community colleges, and now we see online universities really as the disruptive innovation, really changing the way people learn across this country. And community colleges, particularly in places like California, are actually starting to restrict enrollment rather than being the open enrollment access places that they were once supposed to be. And so you see this playing itself over and over again. And the question, of course, is why is disruptive innovation so hard to catch? Why is this process of making things more affordable, simple, convenient, and accessible so difficult? And the reason is a fewfold. One is, of course, it doesn't look very attractive at the beginning, and so people sort of thumb their nose at it and buckle down on what they think is the most important problem. And it's often less profitable at the outset and things of that nature. But there's actually an even more fundamental reason, and I just thought I'd tell a story to illustrate the point, which was if you went back to the 1950s and 60s, what you would have seen was that the dominant consumer electronic products of their time, tabletop radios and floor-standing televisions, were in fact powered by vacuum tubes and companies like RCA and Zenith. And these vacuum tubes enabled these very demanding technologies. And an interesting thing happened in 1947 out of Bell Laboratories when scientists there invented what was called the transistor. And the transistor was a very exciting product, but at the out, because it was much smaller, it was more durable than the vacuum tube, which occasionally would blow out and you had to replace it. And it enabled but it was very primitive also at the same time and couldn't power these power-hungry devices like the radios and TVs of the time. But RCA and Zenith, they all saw the potential of the transistor, and so they took a license to it. But then they did something very familiar. They essentially framed the problem as a technology problem. And they, in essence, said, if we just put this into our research and development labs and invest enough money perfecting the technology, we can simply swap the transistor in for our vacuum tubes inside of our tabletop radios and floor standing televisions, and our customers will keep buying these products and be just delighted, and they won't even know the difference. And so in essence, they crammed technology into their existing business model. But the problem with that was that the technological hurdle that the vacuum tubes presented was so high that despite investing over $1 billion in perfecting the technology, they never got it to where it made sense to just do this simple swap. And so RCA and Zenith just never made the transition to transistors. But of course, transistors have totally transformed our lives. And the way they did it was by starting in areas of non-consumption, where the first application for a transistor was actually in a simple product in 1952 in a hearing aid. And if you think about it, a hearing aid required very little power, and a transistor could provide very little power, on top of which a vacuum tube, which was about the size of your fist, was always very impractical for a hearing aid. And so this was just a perfect application for the transistor to get its start. And then a few years later, in 1955, this company no one had heard of, and when they did, they didn't think much of initially, called Sony, came out with this transistor pocket radio. And again, the transistor pocket radio was a crummy device compared to these tabletop radios. It was static, it was very low fidelity. But Sony had a really interesting insight, which was, what if we sold these transistor radios to true non-consumers of tabletop radios, sort of the low end of humanity, people we today call teenagers? They would be delighted with this simple product that was just a couple dollars to buy. They could drop in their shirt pocket and run out of earshot of their parents and listen to their rock and roll music. They'll be just delighted with this because it's way better than their alternative, which is quite literally nothing at all. And then Sony got better and better, and by 1959 they came out with portable televisions. And you can imagine where this goes. They got so good by the late 1960s that literally the vacuum tube companies just vaporized as people rushed out from that inner circle into the outer one with transistors, and were delighted with the simplicity and affordability and power that transistors gave them, and it totally transformed the consumer electronic industry. Now, if you think about it, this is a really painful story because RCA and Zenith saw the transistor well before Sony did. They invested way more money in trying to perfect the transistor than Sony ever did. But because they framed it as a technology problem, rather than a problem of the business model in which this is used, they just could never perfect it because they were constantly trying to cram it into their existing processes and resources and priorities, where it just didn't make any sense. And as a result, Sony transformed the world whereas they went out of business. And I just want to emphasize this point because I think a lot of people in education right now, as online learning and blended learning have gained steam, or iPads or Chromebooks or whatever it might be, they're framing things as a technology problem rather than a problem of the model in which the technology is used. And it's our observation that the model is far more important than the technology. And so it begs the question, of course, what is a business model? And why does it lock us in? Why are business models so quite literally this powerful? And so I'll walk through this body of research, and you might be thinking, well, classrooms or schools or whatnot don't really have a business model, but I think you'll see that actually every organization actually has what's in essence a business, or maybe better could be called an organizational model. And so the first step in any model is basically your value proposition. It's a product or it's a service that helps users do something more effectively, conveniently, and affordably, something that they've been trying to do. And to deliver on a value proposition, what organizations do is that they assemble resources, people, technology, products, equipment, brands, cash, and so forth. Basically, things often that you can hire and fire that are required to deliver this value proposition toward your users. And so in schools, you'll assemble equipment, teachers, buildings, you'll outfit classrooms, internet, et cetera, to deliver upon a value proposition for students and society. And then over time, as these resources work with each other, uh, processes emerge. It's ways of working together to address recurrent tasks in a consistent way. And so the important thing about processes is that they're incredibly sticky. And the reason is because a good process is designed to solve one type of problem very well, but not to solve all problems very well. And if you have a process that is built to solve all problems, it means you have a really, really lousy process in place. And so processes are really sticky because they emerge over time to address these recurrent problems in successful ways. And they become very hard to change because some processes are explicit. They're the ways you write down when you say, you need to purchase something, your order form goes here first, and then it goes through this person who signs off of it, and then the business manager signs off it, and then it gets delivered, right? That's a very explicit process. But the really tricky thing is all of the implicit processes that occur inside of an organization. All of the things that when you show up on day one and you ask someone, why did you just go over to that person to help get that thing done? They say, buddy, that's just the way things work around here. That's just how you do it. And that's really where culture in an organization lives. All of those implicit processes and routines of how you get things done is really the culture of an organization, and it's very sticky. Now, as resources and processes coalesce, priorities emerge. In essence, the revenue that you have to bring in to support those processes and resources. And oftentimes that actually determines the actual value proposition that you're delivering rather than the one that you maybe had set out to deliver at the outset. And what we see is that as these things sort of work their way through a few times, they become very interdependent and locked. And so any idea that does not fit these four boxes for an organization, people either twist and turn it to meet the needs of the organization rather than the needs for which it was originally established, or they just reject it completely. And that's why disruption is so hard to catch. So I'll give you an example outside of education, where I used to work at America Online. And in the 2000s, I worked on a product to introduce AOL pictures. And when I introduced, I had identified, along with the team, a particular niche segment of the population for this new offering. We had priced it in a way for buying photographs that we thought was attractive, and on and on. And it literally was not one day before the finance department showed up at my door. And they said, Michael, we thought you'd been at AOL more than a day, but it's apparent you haven't, because these margins that you're promising don't fit our business model. They don't give us enough money to make this attractive. But if you'd work with us and just change these assumptions here and level up this price there, then we can let this go and we'll let your product launch. And then a couple days later, marketing department came to me and said, you know, you're promising to target these customers, but we don't have any campaigns that target those people. And if we do, it'll confuse people about what our brand is. But if you'd work with us just to change this and then target these people over here, we can make this work. And on and on and on, right? And so literally 5, 6 people came to me and twisted and turned the idea until it fit the needs of the business model rather than the market for which the product was originally intended. And this occurs literally in every organization, from schools to colleges to Congress and so forth, that we see this twisting and turning. And what we realize as a result is that business units or individual organizations are incapable of evolving, but corporations, if you will, are capable of it. And I'll talk about what that means in a second, but it's a little like evolutionary biology. We as individual organisms are incapable of evolving in the course of our life, right? But as people among us with mutations gain market share, so to speak, that are more advantageous, the human race as a whole can evolve over time. And it's the same principle here. If you There's actually some people who have survived disruptive innovation, and the way that they did it every single time was to set up an autonomous team with the freedom to completely rethink their business model and how they did things. And as a result, they were able to make the switch. And so IBM was, for example, one of these companies. And the way that they were a leader in mainframe computers, and then they were a leader in mini computers, which were disruptive to mainframes. And then they were a leader in personal computers, which were disruptive to mini computers. And the way that they did it every single time was set up a totally new organization apart from the parent that just had the freedom to rethink what are the resources, processes, and priorities that we need to have to make this work. And no one from the parent could say, you're not allowed to do that because it doesn't fit our organization's needs. And as a result, they've been able to successfully disrupt themselves several times. Now, the question, of course, is how do you manage this change? And one of the big things that we've realized as we've done this work is that depending on the level of change that you're trying to make in an organization helps you determine the type of team that you need to deploy to help you make that change successful. And one of our observations has been that a lot of people think you can deliver personalization just by giving teachers more professional development, but that unless you bring the right team together that can really rethink the model in the right ways, all of that professional development won't actually make any sense in an old environment. Instead, you really need to change the models so that this professional development of the new roles of teachers and so forth will actually make consummate sense. And so if your level of change is simply to improve the performance of an individual component, and I'll give more direct examples of this in a second, all you need is what we call a functional team to make that type of change. And so, for example, if you think about education, and just say you want to flip one individual classroom, right? And you're just going to have a teacher flip that classroom. That teacher actually doesn't need to work with any other parts of the organization to make that sort of a change. And so within their individual classroom or within their individual math department or within their individual, say, grade 3 teachers, that's a sort of change that they can make where they don't need to work with people in other departments within a school. And so all you need there is a functional team. And functional teams are very effective when you're able to work in a silo to solve a problem. The challenge comes that when you have to change the specifications for how different components fit together, then that introduces a level of interdependence where the change that I make within my classroom is going to impact the way another classroom or subject area works. And therefore, a functional team where you don't interface with people across the organization quite simply is not going to solve the problem. And so when you're in this circumstance, you need what we call a lightweight team. Because if you try to force people to make change within their silos, they're just going to get very upset at the bureaucracy and so forth, because they're not going to be able to work seamlessly with people across the school to make the types of changes you need. So here's an example, which is, say you need to make a change you're going to make a change in the social studies curriculum, which is going to create very big projects, which is then going to take away time that's available to students to be working on math homework, say, for a given week. You would want to be able to coordinate that sort of a change across departments. And so we call that a lightweight team, where the individuals represented by that gray dot still report to the people within their department, but they work with a project manager that helps coordinate activities across the different departments. And the project manager doesn't have final say on things, but basically is there to just help coordinate activity. And so a lot of resource teams within schools that cut across different departments are in essence lightweight teams. And they're perfect sorts of teams when you're trying to change the specifications for how different things fit together. Now, when you're changing, though, really the resources and the processes, And so basically, what are the components and how do these things fit together? So two levels of the boxes, if you will, within that business model. Then you actually need a totally different type of architecture. And the reason is because if you try to change the product or service architecture within a lightweight team, those people don't have the freedom to rethink the different components that come together to solve a problem, because at the end of the day, they're still beholden to their math department or their science department and so forth. And so as a result, you need what we call a heavyweight team to solve a problem. And a heavyweight team is really where you take the people represented by the black dots and you pull them outside of their department and you say, bring your departmental expertise, but now you report to this project leader who gets final say on what we do. And so I'll give you an example from industry of how this has worked. But if you look at how Toyota created the hybrid Prius car, this was truly a total re-architecture of the automobile, because it involved a very interesting coordination between combustion engine and electronic engine. And so what they did was that they took people out of their functional expertise and say, you no longer are responsible to your department chair or your vice president. Instead, bring your different engineering expertise, and what we want you to do is work together to create what a new car would look like. And if that means that you have to eliminate your component because it makes more sense to do this differently, so be it, because the objective is to create the best car we can create. And so if you look at the Toyota Prius, that's actually very much what they did, right? If you step on the brake, it actually creates energy that powers the battery and so forth. And if you compare that model with how Honda created their first hybrid cars, which they did within a lightweight team, the Honda cars were very kludgy because they basically didn't have that freedom to rethink the entire architecture. And so if we navigate to schools, then my sense is that as we think about re-architecting schools, we really need heavyweight teams to come together that can rethink how do schedules work, how are we going to think about interdisciplinary subjects, what's the crossover between core content versus project time, and things of that nature to really make these new projects sing. And part of the challenge is we often try to implement these re-architectures of schooling within lightweight teams where we don't have the freedom to really rethink how these things come together. Now, last point, which is that when we're talking about a disruptive innovation, so really the business model or the organizational model in which the product is used has to be changed, that's where we need what we call that autonomous team. And that goes to that IBM example, where we literally have to pull people outside of the existing organization completely and just give them carte blanche to rethink how something should work. And you need this type of a model when your priorities have actually changed themselves. When the type of revenue that you're going to need to bring in, and you're going to really need to rethink that model completely. This is really where you need that autonomous team to come into play. Now, the question, of course, is how do you this sounds pretty difficult to do. How do you strategically plan or design these sorts of implementations? And my sense is, from our research, that there's basically two types of design or strategy making processes that exist in the world. The first kind is when sustaining innovations or very predictable innovations are afoot. And it's basically what you do is you make a bunch of assumptions, you build projections based upon those assumptions, you make decisions whether to go forward with the new project based upon those, and then you implement a deliberate strategy. And the thing about this is that, in essence, if as you look, so at say building out a new after-school program that's very similar to other after-school programs you've done before, and you can predict ahead of time the number of students that'll sign up, and how you'll structure the revenue, and what the teaching process is and so forth will be, then this sort of planning process works really, really well. The challenge is when you're entering a world where you just don't know how things are going to work together, and things are just very unpredictable, then you need a very different process, because the problem is if you bring this sort of a strategic planning process to bear, what ends up happening is as you design your strategic plan, inevitably someone will say, well, your projections don't look good enough, and your reaction just to get something implemented is just to drum up your assumptions and just sort of make them bigger and bolder so that the projections look bigger themselves. And it just doesn't fit very well with that sort of a process. And what we say is that when you're innovating in a context where things are so new that you don't know how they work, instead you want to follow this process over here, which is called a discovery-driven planning process. And I apologize that my slide is getting a little bit cut off for some reason in this format, but the basically in discovery-driven planning, you reverse the process, and instead you start with your goals or your outcomes in mind. You make your projections. You basically say, what's the problem that we're trying to solve, and how would we know when we had solved it? So, for example, KIP LA, which did a very good station rotation model, the problem that they were trying to solve, of course, was budget cuts had threatened their school, and so that when they were opening up, and so that they wanted to create a new model that would preserve the opportunities for small group instruction. And they might have said something like, we want to see at least 90% of our students advanced or proficient 3 years from now. And so underlying that, then you would say, what are all the assumptions we're making under what we've designed that have to prove true for these projections to occur? And so you question everything from, will the software be good enough that we're implementing? Do we have the right model? Do we have the right teachers? Do we have the right training? All of these sorts of questions. And you would start to test these assumptions over time to see if they're reasonable. And then you would actually go forward once your assumptions prove true or not. And so the emphasis, in essence, is actually on the assumptions as opposed to the other process where it's really on the projections. So let me give you a little bit more granularity here, because I'm sure it's a little confusing at the moment. So the first question is, how do you know which strategy process to follow? And my basic rule of thumb would be that when your ratio of knowledge to assumptions is really high, so it's something very similar to what you've always done, then you can just progress in the way you've always done things with a very deliberate strategic planning process. But as we get into these new worlds of serving new students or completely new offerings of personalized learning, my sense is that as you push that envelope more and more away from what we've always done, that our knowledge declines precipitously, the way we know something works, and we're making just tons of assumptions about how the world works. We have lots of beliefs and hopes, but we don't actually know. And as a result, you need this emergent strategy making process, or this discovery-driven planning process as well. Some people think of this as sort of a lean startup. And the theory, in essence, is that rather than going out with a huge rollout of a program from day one and just doing a massive implementation like a lot of schools will often do, and then finding out that you had the wrong strategy, sort of what Scott Cooks has famously said about Intuit: for every one of our failures, we had spreadsheets that looked awesome. Rather than thinking you have the right plan, instead inject some humility and basically say, sort of think about it guiding around the basketball hoop, if you will, and just take small little steps where you keep testing your assumptions and keep tweaking back and forth on your way to a successful strategy. And so the real idea here is that you would develop your assumptions and risks, and then you basically start to figure out which of these assumptions are the most important, where if we're wrong, game is over. And so you sort of very aggressively make lists of all of the assumptions that you're making inside of your project plan, identify those that are most at risk, and then you start testing and learning. And some of these tests might be simple. Hey, ask the school district next door that already did this to see if it worked, or read some research. But oftentimes it'll be, let's put a prototype in place, the minimum viable product that allows us to really cheaply and quickly test whether this is even a viable idea that we think will work. And then as you start to learn those lessons from it, you absorb and redirect. You basically start to tick and tack back and forth to figure out if you can actually make this work. And sometimes you'll find that your assumptions are so far off that that it's just not going to work and the game is over. Whereas other times you'll find out, hey, this is really a fruitful way, but we just have to make some adjustments about how we thought students and teachers and so forth would interact in these environments, such that we can really make this happen. Now, what I would encourage you to do that is, in essence, design your blended learning or personalized learning model. Figure out what you want to do, and then just say, these are the goals, that this is what it has to look like for us to be excited about it. And then start asking yourself, what are all of the assumptions that we're making underlying this that have to prove true for us to realize this goal from this design process? And so think about the students' needs. Are they able to make this work? Think about the solution. Are there software that exists that does the sort of things that we're promising it will do? Are we relying on partnerships that can actually come through to do this? Are we talking about creating new technologies or something like that? And are we able to do those things? What's the sort of business model, the sort of money that we need to bring in to support these things? On and on and on. Now, this list is from business, really, but you have to think about competition in this day and age. Will charter schools or will other private entities start to do things? Do we have the right organization in place to really make this work? And what's the upside from this? Is this actually something worth spending a lot of time on at the end of the day? Really think expansively about assumptions and brainstorm and just list completely all of these things. I often think of this like a design workshop where you just literally put hundreds of Post-it notes up on the wall about all of the assumptions you're making. And then what we say is prioritize them. Figure out what are the ones where you're very confident that you understand how the world works. You really understand that you have a high level of knowledge about how the world works, such that you're actually willing to make a very confident bet and give up 1 year's worth of salary if you're wrong. And so if your confidence is there versus you actually have very low confidence in how the world works because your knowledge is very low, and therefore you wouldn't be willing to give up any salary at all, and then plot that on one end, and then rank on the other end the danger if you're wrong, what happens. And so on the one side, the danger could be very low, as in it's actually, we don't know very much about this, but it doesn't matter if we're wrong. Whereas on the other end, the danger could be very high, that if we're wrong, this is a catastrophic mistake and the entire model will collapse. And so that's sort of how you think about ranking these things. And out of that work, you'll get sort of 3 different zones. Zone 1 is where we better test these assumptions right now. Zone 2 is we'll test these assumptions later. And zone 3 is actually it's not a big deal because we have a lot of knowledge about how these things will work, and if we're wrong, it's actually not a big deal, and so we'll test them last. And so as a result, you sort of rank order your assumptions and how you have to test them. And then what we say is test your assumptions creatively. Create a rapid, good enough prototype, for example. Talk to other people who have done things. Talk to people in your school districts to see if this looks even attractive. Really bring things in and test early and often, because it'll save a lot of time on the back end. And the goal is to really get fast, insightful feedback. And what we say is in the very beginning of just piloting this, just do basic gut check things, right? Just like super high level tests are good enough in the early going, just to say, are we on the right track? And as you get closer and closer to implementation, make sure your tests get finer and finer and are more aggressive prototypes and actually, in some cases, implementations in a pilot way before you actually go forward. And sort of what I would say is celebrate the milestones along the way to figuring out if this will work. Sometimes you'll hit an assumption and you'll do your test and it'll look really attractive, and it'll say, hey, double down on the strategy, we're going really the right way. Sometimes it'll sort of get a tentative response, like we think this worked, but maybe we didn't implement it quite well enough, so if we do this again, this really is the right direction. Other times you'll just get clear investigation that says, the way we're going is just totally wrong, but it revealed a different way that is viable. And sometimes you'll just say, hey, we're just totally wrong about this idea. It's a really bad way to go forward. And thank goodness you did it really cheaply and quickly and got that feedback within, say, a couple of weeks, rather than doing a full implementation of a year and risking a lot of credibility within the community and a lot of dollars and so forth. Now, I think I'll do one last theory here, and then maybe pause, Carrie, if that's okay, and just take questions, because we're going through just so much stuff right now. And I have a lot of material that we could go through, and I'll make sure you get all these slides so that you all can think through this later. But basically, this theory about the tools of cooperation has emerged from our thinking about what sort of tools will help us manage change at different times as we implement things. And so on the y-axis, I want you to think about the extent to which there is agreement on the goals that people want for an organization, okay? So there's broad consensus on the top end of, gee, we really think that these test scores signal college and career readiness, and that's the way the world works, versus no consensus on the goals would say, we don't actually agree that this is a worthwhile goal of what we want out of this implementation. And then the other, on the x-axis, would be the extent to which there's consensus about what actions will actually lead to these sorts of results. And so if you imagine, you can say, we forget about whether we share the same goals or not, but in essence, the question is, do we think that doing these sorts of things will lead toward a given result, regardless of whether that's a goal that we want? And so the obvious example here would be if you say, well, we don't think test scores is the right goal, but we know that if you implement this sort of lesson plan, we know that this will lead to a desired outcome on the test, okay, just as a hypothetical. And what we see is basically that there's a couple quadrants of action. And so when there's no consensus on what goals that we have, and there's also no consensus on what things lead to what results, we really need to use what we call power tools to affect change. And this can be very difficult in district settings. But basically, this is where you have a very strong leader that just basically says, I don't care if you agree with me or not, but this is the way we're going with this, and we're going to implement it whether you like it or not. And in areas of just very big disagreement about how the world works, you just need power tools to create a consensus or to create action in an organization, because otherwise people will constantly be arguing and never agree. And your hope is that as you implement these things, you can start to migrate and enjoy success to have better and better results over time, and move toward more and more consensus about how the world works and what goals there are. So if you move toward more consensus about how the world works, but no consensus on on the goals still, then what we see is that management tools will actually work really well. And so these are basically measurement systems or training procedures or standard operating procedures. Those sorts of tools will work really well in terms of creating cooperation and change in an organization when there's that sort of an agreement. But management tools like training and standard operating procedures and measurement systems work really poorly in the lower left-hand quadrant when no one agrees on anything. Likewise, when you move into the upward quadrant there, where there's high agreement on the goals that you want for an organization, but very little agreement on the way that the world works, sort of what actions will lead to what results, then we see that leadership tools are very effective. So things like charisma, big visioning statements, and so forth are very effective, because you can inspire people to actually march in the direction that you think is important. But what we see is that leadership tools, visioning statements, and so forth work really poorly when people don't agree on the goals, because people just sort of roll their eyes and say, that's actually not very important, in fact. And so this sort of this sort of action is just not an important goal that's worthwhile. And so these tools work in very specific examples. And then in organizations where there's high consensus about how the world works and high consensus about what actions will lead to what results, then you can use culture tools. And this is really where democracy or rituals or folklore, culture can really help to galvanize continued cooperation on existing goals. And sort of in between, you have financial incentives or negotiation or strategic planning that sort of sit in between as tools that you can use when you're trying to galvanize action, when there's sort of middle ground on these two axes. And I just say this by way of saying that I think a lot of people right now have a theory of action that simply doing merit pay or having a strategic plan or something like that will galvanize change within a given district. And it could be the case that that's true, but really it's important to look at the specific circumstance in which you are in to see if those sorts of tools will or will not work as you're doing this redesign process. And the last thing I would say is there's one tool that's not on this graph that is sometimes important, which we call the tool of separation, which is really when you're in a category where there's no agreement on how the world works and there's no consensus on what we want, sort of in that power tool quadrant. And sometimes that's when you need the tool of separation to create those independent teams that have actually significant agreement within the team and therefore give you that freedom to actually invent that future that you need to do. And your hope is that over time, showing that success, that you can start to migrate the broader organization toward the upper right-hand quadrant and really affect change. Carrie, I think I'll pause there because I've said a lot and there's way more I could say. But I think I think I'll maybe just stop with this last slide, which is what I would sort of encourage you that is, as you're implementing blended or personalized learning, really start with your goals and your hypothesis that you have in mind, solve a very particular problem, then be very clear on what success would look like with very measurable outcomes that are very concrete. And then the third thing you want to do is bring the right team together so that you can solve that problem. If you don't have the right team in place, you won't be able to affect change. And then start thinking about designing the model, putting the right culture in place, content, technology, facilities, staffing, all of these interdependent things. Figure out that design, and then start to do that discovery-driven planning where you start to identify and prioritize your beliefs, and then test aggressively and adjust accordingly. And I think that's where I would leave you with for the moment as a framework for thinking about how to innovate in just these really uncertain times. And what I hope I've been able to do is just give you some tools that you'll be able to use as different problems arise through this process so that you can create great personalized learning models in your different districts and organizations. So Carrie, I'll be quiet there and yield the floor.
Thank you, Michael. That was great. As folks are thinking of questions for our last couple of minutes here, I was just going to ask Michael if you have kind of a top 2 or 3 or 4 kind of books or resources that you would point people to besides your presentation deck. I think is going to be helpful for actually trying to take these steps. But are there any other resources that you would point people to who are interested in trying to implement some of these ideas?
Yes, so I'd recommend a couple of things. I'm sure you've heard of the Lean Startup book. I'd actually recommend another one, which is Discovery Driven Growth by Rita McGrath, who's really the brains behind that discovery driven planning model that I did at a super high level. And it's really a step-by-step book on how to do this in any organization. And then on her website, she actually gives neat resources to help people plan their way through these sorts of processes. And so I'd highly recommend something like that. The second one I'd recommend is The Innovator's Solution that Clay Christensen wrote. And the reason I'd say the solution as opposed to the many other things that he's written is he literally goes chapter by chapter with a different tool for thinking about some of these innovation things and how to make innovation more successful. So I think sort of tool by tool would be helpful in thinking through, you know, when is a discovery-driven planning process the right process versus when is it actually the wrong one? lean startup, discovery driven planning, design thinking, they're not always the right process, depending on the problem that you're trying to solve. And so thinking about that, I think, is really important, as well. And I think those are two things that I would recommend, in terms of the innovation and design process, on top of some of the other ones that I'm sure you all have talked about already.
Great, thank you. And Jill's asking if we can post those titles. And yeah, Jill, I'll post those on both the webinar page and the resources page, so you can find those. Any other questions in our last couple of minutes with Michael here?
I know it's a mouthful,
Yeah,
and my guess is that it'll be easier to take the slides now ex post and start to work through what do they actually mean in some depth, but hopefully it gives you guys some color on how to structure these processes.
yeah, thank you. We're getting just a bunch of thank yous here. Um, we'll give you just another minute of wait time.
No problem. The other thing, Carrie, as I'm thinking about it, some of the things also I think people should be thinking about is, sort of how these play at different levels of their organizations. So sometimes it's just within schools. Can we do sustaining innovations for the current classroom to a station rotation model or a flipped classroom or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Which I think at this stage is becoming more and more of a predictable process. It's not quite deliberate strategic planning. Um, and then there's a different level where you're trying to reinvent what does a learning environment look like completely and what does a school look like completely. And that's really where you need the heavyweight and autonomous teams, I think. Um, and then sort of third is how does the district itself operate to support these processes, which is a whole other set of changes that I think need to be thought through. So there's sort of three levels, I think, of this, that everyone's going to have to be thinking about, as they're working through these models and redesigns over the next several months.
Yep. Great. Well, thank you again so much for your time. This was incredibly valuable, and is very well timed as everyone heads into the convening and starts thinking about the next stage of this work. So thank you, Michael, and all this info will be posted on the shared Google site in the next couple of minutes. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.